The September afternoon was just starting to cool off when Dave heard the boat motor. He was up on a ladder at the main house, scraping old paint from the window trim, one of those endless restoration tasks that came with being caretaker of the Lanford estate. The sound carried clearly across the water, and Dave paused, scraper in hand, watching a small motorboat cut across the harbor, drawing closer. Dave climbed down the ladder and walked along the path that led to the dock, curious. Visitors to the island were rare, especially now that the season had turned. A man in a ranger's uniform was tying up his boat, moving with the easy competence of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. He was maybe in his 40s, tall, thin, but strong. He had a weathered face that suggested years spent outdoors. The ranger called out an afternoon greeting as he straightened up, asking if he was talking to Dave Nichols. "That's right," Dave confirmed. The man introduced himself as Bob Finch and said he worked over at Bull Island. He gestured vaguely eastward toward the conservation land a few miles out. He just wanted to give Dave a heads up. They'd had some vandalism out there. Some idiots breaking into the old buildings and leaving trash around. Probably teenagers from one of the mainland towns. Dave said he was sorry to hear that, but wasn't sure what it had to do with him. "Oh, nothing directly," Bob explained. "I just thought you should know about it, being out here alone on the island. If you notice any boats lingering after dark, anything that doesn't look right, you should call it in." "Sure," Dave agreed. He could do that. He studied the ranger as they talked. There was something about him, not threatening, just slightly off in a way Dave couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the uniform, which looked oddly pristine for someone working on a remote island. They talked for a few more minutes about the weather turning and how Dave was settling into the caretaker job. Bob was friendly enough, easy to talk to. Still, that vague sense of something unusual lingered. Eventually, Bob said he should head back, untying his boat. He just wanted to make sure Dave knew what was going on. "Take care now." "You too," Dave replied. "Thanks for stopping by." Dave watched the boat pull away, heading back toward the mainland rather than out toward Bull Island. Odd, but maybe he had errands in town. Dave returned to his ladder and his paint scraping, but found his mind wandering. Something about the encounter felt incomplete. Like a conversation where you realize later you forgot to ask an important question. That evening, sitting in the small cottage Dave now called home, he pulled out his laptop. He wasn't sure what prompted it. Curiosity, maybe, or just the familiar pull of the internet when you're alone with your thoughts. He searched for Bull Island Ranger and Bull Island Maine staff. Nothing. Well, not nothing. There was plenty about Bull Island itself. The conservation status, the lighthouse at Bull Point, the historical significance. But no mention of current staff, no ranger program, no Bob Finch. He tried different search combinations, even looked up the State Parks Department contact information. Still nothing. Dave closed the laptop. It didn't necessarily mean anything. Not everything was online. He was probably overthinking it, the way he'd been overthinking everything since Sarah died. Ellie Lanford had been right to suggest this job. He needed the quiet, the simple work, the distance from his old life. But sometimes the quiet left too much room for his mind to spiral. He made himself a sandwich and went to bed early, the island quiet around him. The next morning, Dave took the motorboat into Gull'sHaven. He needed some supplies, a few groceries, but really, he just wanted to be around people for a while. The island could feel awfully small some days. Marcy's Diner sat at the corner of Main Street and Bay Street, a comfortable walk up from the waterfront. Dave had been coming here a few times a week since he'd started the caretaker job. It was the kind of place where you could sit quietly with coffee and a newspaper, or chat with whoever was around. The locals had been friendly but not intrusive, which suited him fine. The morning crowd was thinning out when Dave arrived. He pushed open the door to the familiar trill of the brass bell overhead and took a stool at the counter. Marcy appeared almost immediately with a fresh pot of coffee in hand. She greeted him with a smile and asked if he wanted the usual. "Please," Dave said. She was maybe mid-40s, with an easy smile and the efficient movements of someone who'd been running the place for years. She poured his coffee and called his order back to Kenny in the kitchen. She asked how things were going out on the island, wiping down the counter as she spoke. "Can't complain," Dave said. "Quiet, mostly. He mentioned how the Lanfords probably wouldn't be coming back to the island until next summer." Of course, Marcy already knew that. Everyone in Gull'sHaven knew about the Lanfords and the goings-on at Wren Island. Dave wrapped his hands around the warm mug, hesitated, then mentioned he'd had a visitor the day before. A ranger from Bull Island had come by with a warning about vandalism. "Bob Finch?" Marcy smiled and turned, slightly amused. "Yeah, that's him," Dave confirmed. "You know him?" "Oh, everyone knows Bob," she said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Some people say he's a ghost." Dave laughed, thinking it was a joke. Before Marcy could elaborate, the kitchen door swung open and Kenny appeared, spatula in hand as if it were an extension of his own personality. "Ghost Bob?" he said, pointing out how the man disappeared for weeks at a time, arrived silent as a tomb, ate enough for two, and then left without a sound. "If he's not a ghost," Kenny said, "at the very least, that's ghost-adjacent behavior." Some of the other diners chuckled quietly. Marcy gave Kenny a nudge in the ribs, pointing to the kitchen, marking an end to his little comedy routine. Unable to resist, Kenny leaned out of the kitchen window, proclaiming, "When Ghost Bob walks through a wall, I'll be there to witness it." Marcy's son, Nate, came over with a coffee pot, topping off a few cups along the counter, grinning. "Oh yeah," he said. "Bob's definitely spooky." He widened his eyes theatrically. "Maybe he is a ghost. Maybe we're all ghosts." He wiggled his fingers in Dave's direction, sarcastically. Dave laughed, thinking how that was both funny and weird at the same time. Marcy shook her head, silently apologizing for the silliness. Dave played along, but something in Marcy's expression made him wonder. She'd gone back to her work, but there was a tightness around her mouth that hadn't been there before. His breakfast arrived, and the conversation moved on to other things. Normal, small-town talk. Dave ate slowly, enjoying the warmth and noise after days of solitude. But Marcy's comment stuck with him, just a little. "Some people say he's a ghost." What a strange thing to say, he thought, even as a joke. Thinking back on Bob tying his boat to the dock, something occurred to him, something he might not have noticed if not for the ghost talk. Up close, Bob Finch had looked as though he'd stepped straight out of a photograph from decades ago. The colors slightly off, faintly faded, the hues of his perfectly pressed uniform, his face, his slicked-back hair all felt muted, not wrong exactly, just not quite of the present. The thought unsettled Dave, more than he expected. Later in the day, Marcy gave a call to Gus Adams, the harbor master. She knew if Bob Finch was talking about something specific, like vandalism, Gus should know. Gull'sHaven had a certain order of operation. Marcy wasn't one for gossip, but she knew the town, and knew who needed to know what. A few days passed, and Dave was back in town again for a quick trip to the hardware store. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of fall day that made you understand why people loved Maine. A few lobster boats were heading out, their engines rumbling across the water. He turned to see the harbor master walking down the dock toward him. Gus was lean and weathered, probably in his 60s, with the straight-talking manner of someone who'd lived his whole life on the water. Dave returned the greeting. Gus thanked him for passing along the information about Bull Island. He said he'd gone out there to have a look around, and someone had definitely gotten into a couple of the old buildings. Beer bottles everywhere, some minor damage. He'd called the park ranger service, and they were already taking care of it. Dave felt a small jolt of confusion, thinking he didn't report anything. Gus leaned against one of the dock pilings, squinting in the bright sunlight. He explained how Dave had mentioned his conversation with Bob to Marcy, and then Marcy mentioned it to him. A natural progression. "Oh," Dave said. He tried to piece it together. He'd mentioned Bob's visit to Marcy, sure, but he hadn't thought of it as reporting anything, just conversation. "I guess I did, sort of." Gus was quiet for a moment, studying him with an unreadable expression. Then he said carefully that Bob had been looking after Bull Island for a long time. Even after... He paused. "Look, Dave, you seem like a reasonable guy. You're going to hear things in this town, and some of it's going to sound crazy." "Like what?" Dave asked. "Like Bob Finch died in 1969. Heart attack, right there at the lighthouse. Been dead 56 years. The words hung in the air between them. Dave waited for the punchline, the laugh, something to indicate this was the same kind of joke he'd gotten at the diner. But Gus just looked at him steadily, his expression serious. "That's quite a story," Dave said finally. "It's the truth," Gus replied, "or close enough to it." He shifted his weight. "There are things about this town that don't make a lot of sense. You'll figure it out soon enough living here. And Bob's not the only one. There are others. They look real, they act real, they eat and drink and talk, just like anyone else, but they're not quite here. Not the way we are. So you're telling me Gull'sHaven is haunted." "Not haunted, but special," Gus corrected. "And Bob Finch is still looking after his island, the same as he did when he was alive. He came to you because something needed attention, and you passed it along without even knowing you were doing it. That's how it works." Dave didn't know what to say. Gus didn't seem crazy. He seemed perfectly rational, matter-of-fact even, as if he were explaining the tide schedule. But what he was saying was impossible. Gus asked if Dave thought he was out of his mind, reading his expression. "I don't know what I think," Dave admitted. "Fair enough," Gus said. "Just keep your eyes open, that's all I'm saying. You'll see what I mean eventually, or you won't. Some people never do." He nodded toward Dave's boat. "You heading back to the island?" "Eventually," Dave said. "Got a few errands first." "Well, don't let me keep you." Gus paused, then added, "And Dave? If Bob visits again, you can trust what he tells you. Whatever else he is, he's got this place's best interests at heart." Gus walked away down the dock, leaving Dave standing there trying to make sense of the conversation. Ghost stories? In the middle of a Tuesday morning? Either Gus was delusional, or this was some elaborate prank the locals played on newcomers. Dave was never one to believe in the supernatural or little green men, and he wasn't about to go down a ghost rabbit hole easily. He shook his head, walked over to his pickup, and drove up Main Street to the hardware store. Something sensible and real. He simply focused on paint thinner, sandpaper, and whether or not he needed more coffee. That evening, Dave made dinner and tried to settle into his normal routine. A book, some music, maybe a little TV if the satellite signal was cooperating. But he kept finding himself on the laptop instead, searching. Bull Island was easy to research. It had a long history, dating back to the 1600s. It was named after the pirate, Dixie Bull, who'd supposedly used it as a hideout. The lighthouse at Bull Point had been built in 1858, decommissioned, and automated in 1967. There were photographs, historic black and white images of lighthouse keepers and their families, and more recent color photos of the conservation land and the historic buildings. No ranger program, no current staff. The island was maintained by the State Parks Department, but only with periodic visits. No one was stationed there. Dave sat back, staring at the screen. The lighthouse had been automated in 1967. Gus had said Bob died in 1969, 2 years after his job effectively ended. Had he stayed on anyway, unable to let go? It was a sad thought. A man so devoted to a place that he'd lingered there even after it no longer needed him. But that assumed Gus was telling the truth, that ghosts were real, that the laws of reality Dave had lived with his entire life could just bend in one small coastal town in Maine. He found himself searching for Gull'sHaven next, the town's history, its founding in 1744, the maritime culture, the summer tourism. There were photographs of Main Street, the harbor, and the old church. Everything looked exactly as it did in person, charming, historic, normal. He even found an article about Marcy's Diner, a local business feature from 2010 when she'd first opened. The piece mentioned how the building had previously been a general store, closed for years before Marcy renovated it. There was a photo of Marcy standing in front of the diner, beaming and holding a coffee pot. The article mentioned she was a single mother, dedicated to creating a gathering place for the community. It didn't mention her son by name, but there was a line about wanting to build something lasting for her family. Dave clicked on Marcy's name and let the search engine work. More articles about the diner, a few mentions in community newsletters, a Facebook page that hadn't been updated in years. Then, halfway down the second page of results, a different kind of article. Local mother mourns son lost in tragic accident. Dave clicked it, his heart rate picking up without quite knowing why. The article was brief. Nathan Evans, 20, of Gull'sHaven, had died in a single-car accident on Route 7 between Gull'sHaven and Westfield. Police believed he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. He was survived by his mother, Marcy Evans, owner of Marcy's Diner. The funeral would be held at the Main Street Church. Dave stared at the screen. Nathan Evans. Nate. The young man who joked about everyone being a ghost, wiggling his fingers and grinning. He searched for more. Found an obituary that included a photo. Same face, same easy smile, though the picture looked younger, more formal. Found a few mentions in school records, athletic achievements, nothing remarkable. Just a normal kid who died too young. Only 10 years ago. Dave was still dealing with his own grief, the loss of his wife, but he thought about how hard it must have been for Marcy to lose her son and still keep her business going. He closed the laptop. His hands were shaking slightly. He got up, paced the small cottage, and looked out the window at the dark water. The lighthouse at Bull Point was visible in the distance, its automated beacon sweeping the darkness. Regular, reliable, real. First, Bob Finch, and now Nate. Dave tried to rationalize it. Maybe Nate had a brother, a twin even. Maybe the obituary photo was of someone else. The explanations felt flimsy, even as he constructed them, but they were something to hold on to, something to keep him anchored to reality. Dave thought about Nate at the diner, pouring coffee, making jokes. Solid, real, completely ordinary. How could that be the same person in the obituary photo? How could someone who died in 2015 be walking around, working at his mother's diner, living a normal life? Unless Gus was right, and Gull'sHaven really was special. They look real. They act real. They eat and drink and talk, just like anyone else. He would find out in the morning. Morning came eventually, gray and misty. Dave went through his routines mechanically. Coffee, shower, the boat ride into town. He wasn't sure what he planned to do, only that he needed to see for himself. He needed to confirm that he hadn't imagined it all, that Nate was really there, and really working at the diner, despite being 10 years dead. The diner was moderately busy when he arrived. Dave took a booth this time instead of the counter, wanting distance, perspective, wanting to observe without being obvious about it. Marcy was at the register, ringing up a customer. Kenny was audible from the kitchen, singing off-key to a radio. And there, refilling coffee cups, was Nate. Dave watched him move through the diner. Nothing unusual, nothing ghostly. Nate laughed at something an elderly customer said. He cleared plates efficiently, He moved with the easy rhythm of someone who'd worked there for years. But now that Dave was looking, really looking, he saw small oddities. The way Nate's reflection in the window seemed slightly paler than it should be. The way other customers' eyes seemed to slide past him sometimes, as if he weren't quite there. The way Marcy never quite looked at him directly, though she clearly knew where he was and what he was doing. Dave felt his understanding of reality tilting, settling into a new configuration he wasn't ready to accept. Marcy came by with a coffee pot, filling his cup without asking. She glanced toward the back of the diner, then leaned in slightly. "Someone wants to say hello," she said quietly, nodding toward a booth at the far end. Dave turned. Bob Finch sat there in his ranger uniform, working his way through what looked like a massive breakfast: eggs, pancakes, sausage, home fries, toast. Bob looked up and caught Dave's eye and gave a small wave. Dave's legs felt unsteady as he walked over. His mind was screaming that this couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. But here was Bob, solid as anything, mopping up egg yolk with a piece of toast. Bob greeted him with a smile. "Got a minute to sit?" he asked, nodding to the empty seat across from him. "Sure," Dave said, sliding into the booth. Bob said he just wanted to let him know they'd taken care of that situation out at Bull Island, got the building secured and cleaned up the mess. There probably wouldn't be any more trouble. He took a bite of his pancakes. "Thanks for passing the word along." "I didn't mean to," Dave said. "I didn't even realize I was." "That's usually how it works," Bob replied with a smile. "Information gets where it needs to go, one way or another." Dave watched him eat, watched the food disappear, watched him drink his coffee, completely normal and mundane. He wanted to ask the question directly, "Are you dead? Are you a ghost?" but couldn't quite form the words. Instead, he asked Bob how long he had been working at Bull Island. "A long time now," Bob said. "Can't imagine doing anything else." He signaled to Nate for more coffee. It's good work, taking care of a place like that, keeping an eye on things and making sure the history doesn't get forgotten. "But the lighthouse was automated in 1967, Dave said, carefully. "That's right," Bob agreed. "Technology marches on." He took a sip of his coffee. Still needs someone to watch over it, though. Buildings don't maintain themselves. Dave tried another angle. "Do you live out there? On the island?" "Sometimes," Bob said. "Sometimes I stay in town. Depends on what's needed." He looked at Dave directly. "You ask a lot of questions." "Sorry. Just trying to understand." "Understand what?" Bob asked. The moment stretched out. Dave realized Bob was giving him the choice. Push for a truth that would sound absurd to any rational person, or accept the mystery and move on. They talked for another minute, about nothing in particular. Dave stood up and thanked Bob for the heads up about the vandalism. He held out his hand for a handshake, possibly one last test. For a brief, awkward moment, Bob looked at him, then wiped his hand on a napkin and shook Dave's hand firmly. His grip was solid, warm, completely real. "Any time," he said. "That's what neighbors do." As Dave made his way back to his booth, he caught Marcy giving him a quick glare. As he looked over the breakfast menu, his thoughts swirled with all the ghost talk, the meeting with Bob, his conversation with Gus, his research about Nate. And now Bob, sitting in the booth, real, defying everything. Was all the talk just pre-Halloween fun? Dave sipped his coffee, mulling over everything, wondering if being alone on that island was affecting his mind. Suddenly a dish crashed in the kitchen, jolting him out of his light trance. Kenny yelled out, "Yee-haw!" banging on some pots for extra emphasis. Some of the patrons clapped in amusement. Dave looked up, looked around the room, and Bob was gone. It shook him a little. He hadn't seen him pass by, didn't hear the bell over the entrance. Dave hadn't even ordered yet, and Bob had already polished off his entire breakfast and vanished. Nate was already over clearing Bob's table as Marcy walked by knowingly, waving a check and some cash. His money is real, she said with a sly smile. Dave stood up to look out the windows. Nothing. He stepped outside and looked down the sidewalks. Down Main Street. Down Bay Street. Nothing. He stepped back in the diner and looked around wildly, but no one else seemed to notice anything unusual. The other diners kept eating, kept talking. Marcy was at the register, counting change. Kenny was back to singing in the kitchen. Nate was setting new placemats and silverware at Bob's table. Everything was normal, except it wasn't. Dave finished his coffee, deciding to pass on breakfast. He stepped outside, into the gray morning, and slowly made his way down the hill to the waterfront. He thought about Bob's handshake, still feeling the pressure of it on his palm. He thought about Nate, clearing a dead man's breakfast dishes. He thought about a mother running a diner with her son who died 10 years ago, and a ranger maintaining an island, decades after his death, and a whole town that somehow made space for the impossible. Dave had come to the diner that morning, hoping for answers, but left, being more confused than ever. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe, and stay on the lookout for part 2.